Hi everyone, I'm Adán Martín. Welcome to the second part of my forest pack tutorial. In this second part of the tutorial, we are going to apply the theoretical concepts that we saw in the first part, to first investigate a little how we can distribute grass on a surface, and then, finally, we will create this scene that you have in the image using forest pack and Vray. For this tutorial, I am going to put at your disposal these elements that you can find on the Facebook page, and they are totally free. Let's get started, and I hope it will be very interesting. Before starting to set forest to distribute our objects and create with them grass or create a forest with them, for example, let's see a very important thing that many people greatly neglect when trying to create a realistic grass or when trying to create realistic vegetation, and they are the models that we are using to create our lawn, for example, in this case. The models are a really very important thing. We cannot pretend that if we have bad models, we create an extraordinary lawn. These models, to create grass, to create, plants, trees, etc., you can normally find in the form of libraries, which simply they are a pack, for example, to create FedEx. You buy it and you have a lot of models to create your lawn, or you can create yourselves. These types of geometries take a long time to make, so acquiring this type of bookcase is usually quite interesting, since they can save us, especially in our professional work, a great deal of time. The ones that are here right now on the screen have been modeled by me for this tutorial, and I am going to share them with you for free, so that you have something to start from. Consider what I always tell you. What I do in a 30-minute or an hour tutorial is obviously not as good as what you can do if you spend hours creating amazing vegetation. So, always think of these REAC tutors of this type of resource as a starting point. Well, if you don't have any models to work with, you can't afford to buy a bookstore, and you want to start making something, you can use these models. But the idea is that once you have already understood the basic functions of this type of tools, you make your own models, dedicate much more time to them, more attention to detail, and surely you will end up with something much better than this. Okay? So, to model this type of resource, there are basically two strategies. One is to do it by hand, which has advantages. If you have absolute control over what you are doing, and if you know how to model well, you can do whatever you want, and another is to use a plugin to moderate them. I almost always use a plugin called GrowFX to moderate this type of geometry. It is very easy to use, and there are several tutorials on this channel on how you can get started with this tool. And another option would be to model them with polygonal modeling. You also have several tutorials on that topic on the channel. We are going to see the two options so that you can decide which one interests you the most. Personally, I think that taking into account the good results you get with GrowFX or any other similar plug, it works for you too, and taking into account how fast it is, I'd love to use these types of tools. But we can do it by hand. For example, these models here have been modeled by hand, and as you can see, there is no mystery. It is very easy to model this type of geometry. We're going to Faruna so that those who have no idea how to do this type of thing can more or less understand it. But I'm telling you it's very basic. We can start from one of a plane, for example, and simply with the avoidable polyvone mesh tools, we create our festbed. We give it a festbed shape. We are going to create a festbed here. What do I know? A random. Think that it is important, as I always tell you, the references, because there are many different varieties of FedEx, and it is important that you keep in mind that depending on the FedEx you want to model, you will have to make some models or others. Now we're just going to use it with a very basic one. We are setting no reference, but we are creating something very, very basic so that you understand how it works. So, we could moderate, for example, a geometry in this way. We could also apply certain modifiers to them. For example, we can apply an OIS, which will save us some work, and very quickly we will be able to create, different patterns. For example, we can create this geometry, we can duplicate it, and now we just have to change it. The size of this noise to get a completely different sheet. We could use, twist any of the modifiers that you can think of as valid to generate this type of leaves. One important thing I recommend is that you don't just model 3 or 4 types of leaves. Since we will be distributing scripts to create a first credit, it is important that there is variety. In fact, here I have very few. I recommend that you make 20 or 30 leaves at least, so that your guest has more richness, so that there is a greater variety of leaves. So, we have already created our base models, and now we are going to see how we can distribute them to create our host. So that you can understand why I use the method that I use, or why I prefer one methodology to the other, what I am going to do is that I am going to progressively show you different methodology, and thus you will understand the reasons for the decisions we make when we create or when we try a realistic lawn. First, we are going to start with the most basic, which would be starting with a few hand-modeled leaves, trying to fill a surface using a follet. In this case, we have a plan of about 5 square meters approximately. We are going to stay here within the software tab, our forest on this surface. And to make our task easier, I have created all these sheets. They are in a selection group called Sheets 01. So now inside Forest, we add this selection group. And we remove the original geometry, and in this way we have added all our leaves to our forest. You have already seen in the first part of this tutorial that to increase the density of our forest within the Distribution Map tab, we decrease this value. We are going to lower this value, so that more and more grass blades are generated, and by default, since they are all oriented in the same direction. We're going to change that inside the Transform tab, and we're going to add randomly. For example, we're going to add a rotate, a random rotation in X, Y, and Z. We're going to add a random scale as well, just so it doesn't show that we're only using 10 sheets. And a problem we have when we try to fill one on the surface using only blades of grass is that the point will come. We are going to lower this value. The point will come where this happens to us, and that is that we have exceeded the limit of instances that can be generated by forest. We can solve this by increasing that limit, increasing by clicking here, and always remember that you increase this limit. Make sure that you have enough in the Display tab, because if not, you will see them in the renter. Okay? There are 2 places where you have to change them. So we're going to try with a value that's that big to start with. We're going to try maybe with, 30. It could be something like that. The problem with using so many instances is that there's a way this won't slow down a bit, and there's no way this won't be too optimal. Now we are going to see how we can optimize this process. First, we are going to do a to see what we get using this methodology. As the sonders are going to take a while to be done, what I am going to do is that I am going to pause the video, and when they are finished, I will resume the recording and I will comment on the render. As you can see here, we have a grass that, it's not entirely bad, it's very uniform, but it would be worth more or less. One drawback of generating FedExpress in this way is what I'm telling you, that here we are covering a very small area, it's 5 meters. But if this were hundreds of meters, it would be very difficult to fill that area using only blades of grass. And also, it is very difficult to generate, that suddenly there is a thicket here, or that suddenly there is a slightly larger accumulation of grass, and so on. It is not the most optimal way to create our FESPED. For this reason, the most normal thing is to create small groups of grass, and instead of distributing independent sheets, we are going to distribute small groups of grass. We can do this in many ways. One option that we could give you is to model those small groups of grass by hand, and another option is to use Forest to generate those small groups of grass. Let's create, for example, a FEST group with a radius of 20 centimeters. And so now we're going to create our forest in this sprint, and we're going to tell it to use this selection group that we created earlier, the Leaves 1. Let me also delete this grass so that the viewport looks better. We don't have to wait. And now to make the density of this FedEx higher, I have to lower this value. We are also going to add randomness for, so that it is not so monotonous and the repetition is not noticed in our FESPR. We are also going to add a change of scale. And when you want grass groups, you have two possibilities. I'm going to show you both. One option would be this one that you are seeing here, and it is that you have two fairly dense groups, and your goal is that, when distributing them, they look more or less like this. They look like the ones I have here. The problem with this ecology is that it is easy for repeated groups to be noticed within forest, and for example to leave a hole at some points. And the other option that you have when creating small groups of grass is to give them a lower density. And when we distribute them, what we are going to try is that instead of being separated, they are very overlapping on top of each other, so that in the end we have a good density overlapping each other. This means that the repetition is not so noticeable, but on the other hand, we need more groups to achieve the same density. So we are going to create, for example, we are going to create 3 groups. For now, everything. We are going to give them a little more density so that the density is not so little. Perhaps something like that can be good. And we're going to copy them twice. Whenever you want groups or try to distribute, well, I don't know, a seed, a type of flower, try to create at least 3 different varieties so that repetition is not noticed. With 3, if the object isn't too characteristic, it's usually enough. If you can create more, the better, but 3 is usually enough. We are going to make that instead of all of them being round. Well, here, what do I know? A bit of variety on the edge, so that we don't notice so much the repetition of these small groups when he distributes them using forest. This is by eye or randomly adding a bit of imperfections, and in this one I'm going to do exactly the same. This is splin speaking. We are going to refine this splin a bit to have more vertices to work with. Here we do the same, we add a bit of imperfection, and in this other exactly the same. Now when I distribute these small groups, we have 2 options. We can directly distribute these forests, and thus we will be able to modify them later or transform these forests into an editable geometry, which is the option that I normally prefer. Because if you don't do it that way, you're also going to end up with a bunch of instances in the end. And for optimization purposes, I personally find it better to transform these small groups into geometry. In order to do that, you have to make sure that the geometry on display has this mesh option turned on, and now you just make them avoidable mesh. We are going to do the same with all of them. So now we have 3 small geometry groups that we are going to distribute using forest. This will allow us not to have so many instances and therefore not to notice the repetition of groups to others. Let's create our forest again. And in this case, instead of adding the leaves, we're going to add our personal and favor elements, our little groups. This other group. And now the same thing, we increase the density here again. But now since we have groups, we don't need so much density to fill this surface, and notice that with a much higher density, we have filled the surface. Another important thing we're going to do is add, as usual, randomness, in this case, in the rotation. Since we no longer have individual leaves, instead of applying rotation in all 3 axes, I'm going to apply rotation only in the z-axis, because if I apply it to x and I, it is possible that my small group of Fesped gets too inside from the Earth. So we're going to remove this option from here, and we're going to leave it just the z-axis. And we're also going to have a variation in the scale. In addition to this, I am going to modify this option on the surface, because I don't care that they are always facing up, and I want the grass to adapt to the surface on which I am. tributing my lawn. We already explained this in the first part of this tutorial, and now we are going to make a render to see how the result is using small groups instead of individual sheets. The first thing you'll notice is that the render goes faster, because there aren't as many instances in our scene. And besides, do you see that Noah already has that homogeneous appearance in our guest? Suddenly there's a hole. Suddenly there's a whole group that's a little smaller or that's a little bigger. So, the degree of randomness using this method, I personally like better. For now, just stick with the idea that it is usually much better to use small groups of fesped, instead of only using individual leaves of fesped. Using the same technique, we have created a group that has, in addition to blades of grass, some clovers. And what are we going to do? Well, the same as before, we are going to create our forest. We are going to create two custom geometries. One is going to be our normal fest, and one is going to be our clover fest. And now we are going to change the distribution map to make it more dense. Well, leave me, because it seems that something has happened on the surface. Let's make sure everything is okay. We're going to zero this out so that our FedEx fits our surface, and we're going to do, as we always do, add a little variety to it. We are going to render it so you can see what we have. And with this exercise, we are going to do a couple of interesting tests. Let's first see what we have here. See, our lawn is a bit more interesting now. Maybe we've gone too far with the shamrocks. So what can we do? Within forest, we can establish the amount of probability that each of the elements has. For example, come on, let me mark it by ID, because I haven't done it right, naming the objects. I always recommend that you name your objects so that what just happened to me doesn't happen to you. You can't identify what it is which. So now we've switched to display by ID mode. Now I can actually identify what they are. Okay? And the clovers? Well, I see that these are here. And what we are going to do is that we are going to lower the probability that these objects will appear, for example, to 20%. We can even lower the scale, for example, that is, make those clovers a little smaller. And now we are going to do a render. And see? Now we have a lawn that not only has leaves, but in some areas has clovers. We can do this in many ways. We could have created another forest to generate the clovers and just distribute some individually. But what I want is for you to see several possibilities in which we can use the plug in the forest pack. For example, using clusters, what we can do now is use the cluster distribution mode. Imagine, for example, now we go here inside the distribution. Instead of telling it to be random, what we want are small clusters. What does this mean? That we are going to create small groups of clovers within our lawn. For example, let's render. Do you see? So instead of having clovers everywhere, we have small, isolated clumps of clovers, which is generally how grass behaves. So imagine that now we want to add, for example, above this forest, we could add another forest to distribute, well, leaves or to distribute another type of vegetation. We're going to keep adding more detail to this forest, for example. Let me unlist all my elements here, and I'm going to call it, for example, let's try these elements here. And now the problem we have is if we want to keep, for example, this cluster structure within our forest. If I add another element here, imagine that now I want to add, for example, these lettuces that I have here. The problem I'm having is that those lettuces are also going to be distributed to me in small clusters. If what I want is for these lettuces to be distributed in a different way, what I can do is create another forest. I'm going to duplicate this forest. It takes a while sometimes, and now I'm going to remove one of the items. I'm going to remove the clusters mode because I'm not interested in this being crusters, and I'm going to place my little lettuce here instead of my vegetation. We are going to add all three types of lettuce to these little ones. This one too, and this one too. And now we have a new forest on top of our original forest, which has an independent distribution, and we are going to have fewer of these lettuces because we only want some from time to time. Consider what could happen to you because, for example, what we have done now is that our festbed was super large, possibly disproportionately large, because this is a quick example. And what you can do here is, if you don't want to change the scale of this other forest, of these lettuces, so that they suddenly stick out, for example, as if they were little trees, what you can do is change their object in mushroom. Sometimes this is not noticeable because think what's underneath, you can't see anything at all. While now we have our rechugas sticking out above our Facebook. Let's make a small order. And as you see, we're adding more and more elements to make this grass go from being a drab grass, making a set is much more interesting. You have to keep in mind that the best thing to simulate vegetation or to assimilate anything is to have a good reference. Because there are different species of grass, and perhaps, well, what do I know, this lettuce that I have put here does not match anything in your project. Or maybe you're not interested in clovers, but maybe you are interested in other types of vegetation. Okay? So let's go to, now we could, for example, scale these to these clovers. Maybe they're too much for the lettuces, maybe they're too big, or remove some. And there's something else you can do too that sometimes you might be interested in. For example, imagine that I can now create a new element inside this forest, but deactivate it. And that's going to result in holes in my Ford. Because they are being calculated but not seen in the render. So now, for example, I can change its probability to be, and with this I've created little bald spots on my lawn, for example. Let's render. Now that we have some elements in our lawn and we have seen more or less how we can play with the geometry, what we are going to do is see how we can make the color of this lawn not be so monotonous. And for that we are going to use a map that has forest inside the material editor. In order to show you in this example, I've gone back to our original case and we have a forest with the 3 original groups we created, and with enough density to make it a dense grass. Let's see what material we are using. Let's go here inside the Geometry tab. We're going to open up our material editor. I'm going to create a new tab so that we can work in a clean viewer and not be distracted by everything I have created there. And we're going to take the material that he's using right now, Forest Pack. Our grass right now, all the leaves on our grass have this material, and it is a single material that has a single color. But thanks to a map of forest, which is called Forest Color, we can add randomness to our materials very easily and very quickly. What this material allows us is, for example, we are going to connect our original texture inside this primer, which is this one here, and we are going to replace it with our original material. Now, to add color variation, what we can do, for example, in this case, from here, I could create a different variation. And for example, here I won't add that setting, and I'll add even less to this one, for example. And connecting these different elements in different tabs than those that appear here, it is important that you keep one thing in mind. When using this material variation mode, it is important that our first material is also in our first slot, okay? If you don't put that material in that slot, that is, if you do this instead, go delete this message. If you do this, the first material will not be distributed randomly, only these 2 will be distributed, okay? It's very important. So make sure that when you activate these tabs, the first one or at least one of them has to be your source material, if you want it to be considered for distribution. Let's put it here. And here what you can establish is what degree of importance each of these materials has. If all the materials are 100%, then they will be distributed equally. So that you can see it easily, what we are going to do is that, temporarily, instead of using maps, we are going to use colors. For example, I'm going to use a color that looks great in our render. a red color, for example. And now we are going to render this grass so you can see what happens. Now there are 50% elements that have our green material and another 50% elements that have our red material. If we want there to be less amount of red, we can go to our material. And here I am going to put another red, because this one has a huge albedo and it is slowing down the rendering a lot. We can tell him this is only 10%. And so now when we do our under, we have a lot less red elements. But note that this color variation is being applied per element, not per sheet within each of the moments. To control that, we have these two possibilities. Item would be that each of the objects of our forest, that is each of the objects of our forest, that is each of the objects of our forest, that is each of the elements that are in our tab geometry, you would have a color variation using these maps. And if we put element here inside each of those objects, the individual elements would receive this variation. Let's do the render so you can see the difference. Now we have our randomness instead of per object, per individual elements within our object. Imagine, for example, that what we want to do now is we want some of the leaves of this grass to be dry. Well, let's load another texture, for example, of dry leaf. And then we are going to tell him that 10% of the leaves of our host from now on are going to be dry leaves. So notice that with such a simple change, we have made the grass a little more natural. It is no longer so uniform. It suddenly has some dry leaves, which is very common in any type of grass. Maybe we need that many. We can adjust this value until we find one we like. Pay close attention that if you leave this as an item and Facebook render, the dry leaves are not going to be in the scene from time to time. Suddenly there will be a whole group of dry leaves. So it's a completely different effect. Sometimes you may be interested in precisely that. Well, to simulate small areas on your lawn that have dried up. And other times you will simply want, well, suddenly, a few dry leaves on your host. So right now the result is completely different because now there are whole groups of leaves that are dry and other whole groups of leaves that are green. This could be interesting too, okay? It depends on what you are looking for. And another option that we have to add to the randomness is in addition to using various textures, which we could also use, for example, imagine, we want there to be dry leaves, but we also want there to be leaves that are not so green. For example, we are going to use this texture, which instead of being so green is a little more yellow. And I want, 1% of the leaves to not be as green and be a little bit more yellow, and I could go on creating up to 10 different texture groups to add a lot more randomness to my grass. Let's load several, for example. Now we're going to load this texture because what this texture has is that it has the tip of the blade burned. Let's do, for example, that 10% of the leaves have a burnt tip. 8% have, well, more than a percentage. This is like a degree of importance, because think that I can go 100%, okay? But the more this value is, the less leaves of that type you will see in your renders. We have our green leaves, we have some leaves that have the sharpest point, we have other dry leaves, and we have some leaves that can be, more tender leaves, for example, that have a more yellow hue. And look at the result now, it is much more believable. Also keep in mind that it depends on what you want to create. If you want to create a very fresh grass that is perfect, because you want to convey whatever feeling it is with that grass, then this would not make much sense. If you are looking for a more natural grass that looks more like real grass, then these kinds of things are very, very important. And we are going to see another effect that we can add using this same map. If you look down here, we have a tint option. In addition to modifying the colors or textures individually, both in the elements and in the items, what we can do is apply a general tint to all our elements. For example, we are going to mark this tab, and this is an overdrive. What it is going to do is that it is going to replace all this that we have done here with a tint in this case, which is going to go 100%, 100 to 100%. That is, it will be a total dye. Blending mode is like when in Photoshop, for example, you put your texture in multiply, or in auditory, or in color. It will tributing my lawn. Do exactly the same. And with this Besley favor, we control where the dye is applied. If we put it in item, you will see within this gradient some objects that are orange, other objects that are yellow, other objects that are here in the middle. And if I put it in this other option, there will be random leaves, no longer object, but leaves within this color range. Let's put it first in items so you can see what happens. We don't do this. Since our blending mode was in color, what we have done is that we have changed the color of our objects using colors within the gradient that we had selected, within this gradient that we had selected. If I change the colors of this gradient, for example, we are going to put in this case some strange colors that allow us to see what is happening. For example, a green and a full, and we are going to repeat the render. And we have this other result, where there are elements with colors within the gradient that we have established. If instead of being whole elements we wanted them to be the leaves individually, we would have to move this Besley favor to the end, and think that we can use a combination of both things. This is very, very interesting when we want to add, for example, variation in the tonalities of our trees or our lawns, etc. Now, what are we going to do? We are going to, instead of using this gradient, we are going to use a texture, which is another very interesting option that Forest allows us. When we use a texture, we can tell it to take random values from the ones it finds in that texture and apply them to elements, or to use exact values as if that texture were placed on the surface. Let's look at two examples to see what I mean exactly, so that we can see it well. First, we are going to do the example with a texture where it will be very easy for us to see the effect, and then we will see how it would be in a real case. So the first thing we are going to do is connect this texture here, and we are going to tell it to take random values from those it finds in this texture. That means he's going to take only, in this case, values that are little or black, and he's going to apply them with 100% intensity. We are going to put it by item. It is for the moment so that you can see it in this practical case. The blending mode, instead of putting it in color, we are going to put it in normal. So that means that this blending mode is going to be on top of what we have here, and since it's not in color mode anymore, it's going to completely overwrite this information here. And you see, as we have item mode on, there are some white items, some black items, and randomly, he's applying that dye on our lawn. If we switch to element mode, we're going to have something similar, but what you're going to see is that there's going to be some black leaves, some white leaves, and we're not going to have the variance as abruptly as we'd see before. So we are going to have leaves of different varieties of black and white. As you can see, the result is completely different. And it doesn't matter what shape the texture has, that is, it doesn't matter, for example, that this texture has these drawings. The only thing that matters when we are using the random value mode are the colors that the texture has. Nothing else. Nothing more. However, if we change to this other mode, what we are telling it is to take into account the mapping using this texture, so that the areas of the geometry below our plane, where this white spot appears, are going to be white. We are going to make it look perfectly. What we are going to do is to apply a small prop to this texture, and we are going to keep only that small piece. So, look now, how we have the values of the texture, but also the exact position they occupy in our texture. This is, yes, think about the possibilities we have with this. We can do amazing things with this simple map. We are going to use a slightly more real case. Normally, it is not very normal if you have used a few maps here to add randomness that you suddenly use normal mode 100%, because you are completely nullifying the work you have done up here. The most normal thing is perhaps to use color mode so that there is a variation in color and use lower values, maybe between 25 and 50%, or 25 or 70%, or it depends. Now what we are going to do? Instead of using a color gradient, we're going to use a texture. We are going to use a grass texture. Let's see what I have here. For example, this is a nice texture. Notice that what this texture has is, well, different colors. It is a grass from an aerial view. And we are going to dye our grass precisely with these colors, or take one that is a little greener, like this one, for example. Notice here we have our green grass, but in some parts we are going to create brown grass, as if it were dry. So we're going to plug this map into our texture, so that we can see it well. I'm going to add a little crop as well, because this texture it's for a bigger chunk. So now our fesped is going to have, let's put a little less here. Our grass is going to have randomness, because we have added burnt leaves, we have added completely dry leaves, and we have added slightly more yellow leaves. And in addition to that, there are going to be areas in our host that are going to have more tonalities. Greenish and other areas that are going to have shades, a little more shops. Let's put a little more here, 70 maybe. And we are going to do a render to see what the result is. As you can see, we have created a much more interesting grass because now it is not so uniform anymore. I'm telling you, it doesn't mean that it always has to be like this, but note that this is a grass that is much more realistic, simply because it is not the same color all the time. To finish the tutorial, now that we know how the tools that Forest Pack offers us work and how we can use them to create a realistic lawn, we are going to carry out this practical exercise where we are going to use these free models that I am going to make available to you at my Facebook page to create this image using Forest Pack and Vray. First of all, you are going to study a little this scene that I have prepared for the tutorial. We have a plane with a displacement, which simply has to do with noise, which is going to help us provide irregularities to this surface that is going to make our terrain a little more realistic. And then we have some trees that are going to cast shadows on our plane, although they are not visible in the render. That's going to help our scene not look like it's in the middle of the desert. You can use this technique on many occasions. It can be trees, it can be a building, or it can even be a box that casts a shadow in your scene. That will help make it feel like part of a larger environment. And then we have here these models that, as I mentioned, are available on my Facebook page, which we are going to use to create our fesped. The first thing we are going to see are these groups of grass, which we have three varieties, well, a grass with cut ends, a shorter grass, and a slightly longer grass. When you want to create a lawn, one of the most important things you have to consider is this type of model. With this model that I am going to provide you, you will be able to simply create a type of grass. So it's very likely that if you want to generate a different grass, because there are many needs for FedEx and many ways that FedEx can behave, then you may need to make different models. I am providing these to you then as a starting point so that you are not empty-handed when following this tutorial. So let's create our first forest. We're going to put it on our surface, and now we're just going to add our elements. One thing you can do to make it easier for yourself to add items within your forest is to create selection groups. I have a few selection groups here. For example, I have a selection group for the grass, I have a selection group for the leaves, and so on with each of the elements that I am going to distribute. So now I want to distribute those elements inside my forest. I simply have to add that selection group, and all the elements are automatically added to me. So, as you can see, here we have our forest. And the first thing we're going to add, well, a random behavior. We're going to add random rotation. And remember, when you use small groups of grass instead of individual blades of grass, it is advisable to use rotation in X and in Y, only in Z. And we're also going to add a scale I spoke to. Since I want this to not be too uniform a lawn, I am going to put a large variation between the minimum and the maximum. This is going to cause some parts with shorter leaves and others with much larger leaves. It is going to give me much more irregularity in my fested. And finally, we are going to adjust the scale of our distribution map. We have it here. For now, this one that comes by default seems to work perfectly, and we can keep lowering this value until we have a distribution map that we like. There comes a point, pay attention, when you are distributing over a very large area, that what you are seeing here now in the viewport does not correspond to the number of elements that you are really going to have in your vendor, because the elements that appear on the screen are more of the elements that you have configured in this part of here. So, if you want to display more elements, you can increase this value, but you have to be careful, because this will obviously slow down your viewport a lot. For now, I'm going to leave it with small values so that we can work much faster, and we are going to establish a distribution value here that gives us a density. Well, we are going to try 250, for example, or 300, and we are going to make a render so that you can see what we have with this base grass. Since these renders are going to take a while, what I'm going to do is what we always do. I'm going to start the renders, I'll pause it, and when it's finished, we'll resume it and discuss the result. This is the result of our render with a distribution of 250. And as you can see, our host is not completely dense. There are small areas where we have some holes. In this particular case, I like the result of this amount of distribution. I like that there are some areas where you can see the land. I like that there are some slightly bigger bumps. So I would be satisfied with this amount of distribution, but if you wanted a much thicker lawn, quite the opposite. If you wanted a grass with more bald spots, what you could do is modify this value in the distribution tab. Well, to reduce it, to get more density from our vestment, or increase it to increase the amount of bald patches on our lawn. Now that we've created a base grass, the first thing we're going to do is using our material, which is this one we have here. We're going to add a little more color to this base grass to make it more interesting. We had already seen that we had a forest map, which is perfect for this type of work. Let's add, for example, the first thing we're going to do is replace our original texture with this new forest texture. And remember, when you start to activate these tabs, the first thing you have to do is make sure that your original texture, if you want to use it, is in one of the slots. And now we are going to start adding other textures. The first thing I am going to do is add this texture, but without the color correction, which is a little more yellow than this one. And I'm also going to introduce this dry grass texture, and we are going to connect it in other slots, and we're also going to introduce another texture, where we have a grass with burnt ends, and we are going to introduce it here. And now we are going to tell it, for example, that we don't want so many yellow leaves. We are going to be able, for example, 10% or 0, an intensity of 10 in this type of leaves. We are going to put 8 or 7% here, and we are going to put a little more here, 8%, or come on, also 7%. And so, this is going to add randomness to our grass. Let's tell it that we want this variation to take place on individual elements, rather than on objects. And what we have here would be a great majority of green leaves, this first link that you have here, then a small percentage of leaves, a little more yellow because we have removed the color correction, even less dry leaves, and another small percentage of leaves with burnt tips. We could vary these values to obtain more or less number of leaves of each of the types that we have here. We are going to do a render and we are going to analyze the differences with respect to what we had before. Notice that with this simple change, which is to add a slightly more complex material, we are going to achieve a much more realistic grass. This grass that has exactly the same distribution, exactly the same amount of geometry, since it was totally uniform, doesn't give us such a believable result. However, as soon as we add some random maps, add some dry leaves and some leaves of a slightly different shade, the result is completely different. I recommend that whenever you want to generate large surfaces of grass and you want it to be quite realistic, you concentrate on using good materials, because as you can see, it is something very important. Let's see what we can continue to add to our so that it is not so monotone. We are going to add, for example, in this case, we are going to add some of our lettuces that we have prepared in the Geometry tab. We click on Add Geometry and select our lettuce selection group, which are 3 objects. Right now, if you look closely, it's starting to be very difficult to identify in our viewport what is happening in forest, which elements are what. What can you do, for example, and one thing that I do very often is, well, if I'm using 3 elements to define my base grass, so to speak, I'm going to give these 3 elements a color. And now I am using 3 other elements for my flowers or for my lettuce. I am going to put another color on them, a color that allows me to differentiate them within my lawn. And as you can see now, since we have a 100% probability, well, we have the same lettuce as césped. And this is not what we are interested in. We are interested in simply adding some plants that make our lawn not so pretty. So we have to use, okay, much lower values. It will depend on the type of grass we want to generate. In this case, I am going to use, for example, 1%, even less, half 0.5%. Because all I want is some small, tall plants in some very specific areas of my lawn to help me not be so dull. Let's renderify and see what we get. For now, we've just added a few plants to our lawn, but notice that with only 20 or 30 randomly spread out over this large area, we've made our host a hell of a lot more interesting, and it's not so monotonous anymore. We could add not just one variety of plant, we could add 10 different varieties and further enrich the quality of this grass. So for now, we are going to add these lettuces, and we are going to add, for example, now another element, which is going to help us make our host a little more interesting. And we're going to add these little stems that I had prepared. These little stems, which are a little longer, what they're going to do is that in some parts of our first credit, suddenly, because there is a stem that has grown faster or it is a different plant. As always, I tell you, the best thing you can do, if you want to create a really believable lawn, is to look at photographs of lawn, or even go to a park and look at the species that are in the grass. I already told you it's very rare for a lawn to only have one type of plant. You can usually find a variety of different plants on a lawn. We are going to add now, for example, then, our long stems. We also have 3 types of long stems. We are going to do the same as we have done before, give them a color that allows us to easily identify them, and now we are going to reduce their density a lot. We are going to start lowering this value. We only want that in some parts. Well, we have a few stems. For example, 3% seems to be fine. Let's do a lease and compare it with the previous one. Our stems, mind you, they're barely noticeable, but they're adding a whole new level of detail to our lawn. You have to think that what is really important is the combination of all these little elements to add more realism. Our guest. Maybe, for example, the case of the sizes, if you look closely, the contribution they have is very small, but they are adding that, a new detail that makes this FedEx more interesting. And now we're going to continue adding elements. For example, we're going to now add our shamrocks. Let's add a new group of elements, in this case, clovers. We are going to repeat the same process all the time. We are going to change their color so that we can identify each other well, and we are going to give them, for example, a lower density. 4-5% seems to be fine. If we wanted our test to have a lot of clovers, then maybe we could use larger values. Or if we wanted these clovers to be clustered in 2, we could create another forest, as we saw in the previous example, and simply use that forest to distribute clovers. For now, I'm going to leave them. I'm going to, for example, 5% of clubs, and we're going to repeat the render to see what the difference is. As you can see, the shamrocks were a new level of detail to our FedEx pet, and we have more and more elements in our scene. It is these small elements that are super important to generate realistic grass. Notice that at the beginning we had a completely uniform lawn, not much grace, and by just adding, notice that we have added nothing more than a plant, some clovers and some stems, and we have made this host much more interesting. Typically, if you want a lot of realism, you end up adding maybe 20 or 10 different species of plants to your FedEx. Here we are going to limit ourselves to what we have seen so far, and now we are going to add some small dry leaves, just so you can see what the procedure is. But then, in your exercises, add plants until you are satisfied. Let's add then, now, for example, our dry leaves. In this case, instead of using the same forest, we're going to use a different forest for our dry leaves, so you can see how we can combine several different forests. Let's create a new forest. We are going to give our dry leaves a name that allows us to identify it. And now we are going to add to this forest, using the dry leaves selection group, all of our dry leaves. We are also going to give them a color that allows us to identify the mines in our mess that we have here. Let's put its color pink, for example. Now, it is important when you add, for example, leaves or elements of that type, it is important that you take into account that they are at the base of the grass. And then, as our host will have maybe, 5 or 10 centimeters high because they will not see each other. To be able to see the sheets and to be able to get the sheets to be placed on top of the FedEx, we have to change the Z position of this FedEx. So we have to upload them until we see them. We can also, for example, maybe to scale, I'm going to make them all bigger. We are even going to put a bestiality on it so that they look good in the render, and we are going to make them visible. We are going to raise them until they appear in our fest. For example, it seems that they are already on top of our fesper, and we are going to give them a distribution that allows us to have a large number of leaves on our lawn. They could be, instead of leaves, small dead grass stems. Could be little twigs, whatever you come up with. And now we are also going to add a random rotation to these leaves. In this case, since the leaves can be rotated in any direction, we are going to add random rotation in X, Y, and Z as much as possible. And also we're going to add a random scale to it. And we're going to raffle so you can see the difference. In order to compare everything we've done, so far we're going to compare our final rent Sir to our original render. Notice that the only thing we have done here has been to add a more complex material that adds randomness to the color of the leaves. To add only 3 additional types of plants, which are small stems, our lettuces as I call them, which are simply plants that can appear on the lawn, some clovers, which are another type of slightly smaller plants. And finally, some dried leaves to add color. And look at the huge difference between our base host and our more detailed host. We haven't added hundreds of elements either. It hasn't taken a lot of work to add these elements either. But notice that the render is completely different. Instead of dry leaves, you can add, flowers. If what you want is to simulate a flowery field, they can be white, yellow. And I'm telling you, they can be stones. They can be small branches. Do all the tests you can think of. I always tell you the same thing. I have a limited time in which I can show you these techniques, which is, 1 hour normally when I do my tutorials. But you have all the time in the world or much more time to explore these techniques and make a much better lawn than this. So, don't just follow the tutorial to the letter because you will only be able to make this grass that is designed to be done quickly in a tutorial. Take it further and make a much better lawn than this. Here, as you can see, for the moment, we have entered the post-production stage. I have simply added, some things such as, a bit of an exposure correction, saturation, and a small curve of contrast, just so that here in our previews we have something a little more interesting. The post-production stage is extremely important for any render you do. Okay? So I'll cover the post-production stage in future tutorials, but for now, let's end the tutorial here. It would be great if you subscribe to the channel and share this content with your friends or with anyone you want who may find it interesting. Remember that you can download these basic models to start doing your lawn tests on my Facebook page, and you can also ask questions or suggestions about any of the tutors or future tutors that you have on that same page or on the Twitter page you would like to see appear on the channel. As always, I hope it's an interesting result and see you next time.